I remember the silence most of all, how it settled into the empty classroom like dust, thick and undisturbed, after the last student had gathered their books and disappeared into the hallway's chaos. The final bell had rung 20 minutes ago, maybe 30. Time moved differently in those moments when I was alone with my thoughts and the lingering scent of adolescent cologne and nervous sweat. I stood at the window, my fingers working methodically to close each blind against the October sun. The light had that particular quality of late afternoon in New England, golden but tired, casting long shadows that stretched across rows of empty desks. My hands moved without conscious thought, a ritual I had performed thousands of times. Close the blinds, straighten the chairs, wipe down the chalkboard until every trace of the day's lessons disappeared. The chalk dust clung to my fingertips like a second skin. I rubbed them absently against my sleeve, watching the white powder transfer to the dark fabric of my jacket. There was something oddly intimate about that gesture, though I couldn't have explained why then. Perhaps it was simply the quiet of the room, the way solitude magnified every small action into something that felt significant, weighted with meaning I wasn't ready to examine. I had been teaching at Millbrook Academy for 12 years. 12 years of the same routine, the same careful boundaries, the same measured distance between myself and the world around me. My students respected me. My colleagues nodded politely when we passed in the halls. Parents praised my dedication at conferences, calling me thorough, reliable, committed. These were good words. Safe words. They described a life built on solid ground, constructed with careful attention to what others expected to see. The drive home took me past the same maple trees I had watched turn color year after year. October in New England was supposed to be beautiful, and it was, in that postcard way that makes tourists stop their cars and take photographs. But beauty had become background noise to me, something I acknowledged without really seeing. I thought about the essays waiting in my bag, 32 responses to a prompt about truth and deception in American literature. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I pushed that thought away before it could take root. Clara was setting the table when I walked through the front door. She smiled at me, that familiar expression of domestic contentment that had become as routine as my evening commute. Our daughter Naomi looked up from her phone long enough to mumble something about soccer practice being canceled, then returned to whatever digital world was capturing her attention. At 16, she had inherited Clara's practical nature and my tendency toward solitude, though in her it manifested as typical teenage withdrawal rather than the more complex isolation that had defined my adult life. Dinner conversation moved around me like water around a stone. Clara talked about her day at the library, about the book club she was organizing, about our neighbor's new garden. Naomi contributed occasional observations about her classes, her friends, her plans for the weekend. I responded when expected, asked the appropriate questions, maintained my part in the careful choreography of family life. But underneath the surface civility, I felt that familiar restlessness, the sense of being both present and absent simultaneously. After helping with the dishes, I excused myself to my study. The room had been my refuge since we moved into this house 8 years ago. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with the collected literature of a lifetime spent in classrooms and libraries. My desk sat beneath a single window that looked out onto the backyard, where Clara's carefully maintained flower beds had begun their seasonal retreat into dormancy. I locked the door behind me, a habit that had developed gradually over the years. Clara had never questioned it, accepting my explanation about needing uninterrupted time to grade papers and prepare lessons. It was true enough, though not complete. The locked door was also protection against unexpected interruption, against moments when my carefully maintained composure might slip. The copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass sat on the 3rd shelf from the top, its spine worn smooth from years of handling. I had owned this particular edition since college, had carried it with me through graduate school, through my first teaching position, through the careful construction of the life I now inhabited. My fingers found it without conscious searching, muscle memory guiding me to its familiar weight and texture. As I opened the book, something fluttered toward the floor. A pressed flower, its petals long since faded to the color of old parchment, caught between pages I hadn't visited in months. My breath caught in my throat, sharp and sudden. I knew this flower, remembered the hands that had placed it there, remembered the afternoon when everything felt possible and nothing was decided. The memory hit me with unexpected force. Not my wife's keepsake, not something from our courtship or early marriage. This belonged to someone else, to a time when I had been different, younger, more honest about the things that stirred inside me when I thought no one was watching. I held the brittle petals carefully, afraid they might crumble at my touch, afraid they might disappear entirely if I acknowledged too fully what they represented. Sitting there in my study, surrounded by the accumulated weight of my choices, I felt something crack inside the careful architecture of denial I had spent decades constructing. The flower was such a small thing, so fragile it barely seemed real. But it carried the full weight of everything I had buried, everything I had chosen not to examine too closely, everything I had built my life around not becoming. The silence of the house pressed against the locked door of my study. Somewhere beyond it, Clara was probably settling into her evening routine, and Naomi was finishing homework or texting friends. The normal, predictable rhythm of the life we had created together continued undisturbed. But I sat motionless in my chair, staring at a dried flower that had somehow survived every effort I had made to forget what it meant, and felt the first tremor of something I had been trying to avoid for longer than I cared to remember. In the weeks that followed that evening with the pressed flower, I found myself noticing the architecture of my life with new clarity. How carefully I had constructed each beam and foundation, each room designed to serve a specific purpose, each detail arranged to project the image of a man who had found his place in the world. Every morning began the same way. I woke at 5:30, 15 minutes before my alarm, and moved through the house like a ghost in the pre-dawn darkness. The coffee maker gurgled to life while I stood at the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood emerge from sleep. Clara never stirred during these moments. Naomi's room remained sealed behind her closed door, teenage dreams protecting her from the adult world that waited just beyond graduation. These early morning hours belonged only to me, stolen time before the day's performance began. My drive to Millbrook Academy took me through the same pastoral landscape every morning for 12 years. Rolling hills dotted with colonial houses, stone walls that had marked property boundaries since before the Revolution, maple and oak trees that served as seasonal calendars. Other faculty members often commented on how fortunate we were to work in such a beautiful setting. I agreed with them because it was expected, but beauty had become wallpaper to me, backdrop to a life I inhabited rather than lived. The academy itself was everything a prestigious New England prep school should be. Red brick buildings connected by walkways lined with perfectly maintained hedges. Students who carried themselves with the particular confidence that comes from never having questioned whether they belonged somewhere. Parents who wrote generous checks and expected their children to be transformed into the kinds of adults who would write generous checks in turn. It was an insular world, one that rewarded conformity and discretion, where reputation mattered more than truth. My classroom had become my domain over the years. Everything in its place, bookshelves organized by period and theme, student desks arranged in precise rows that I adjusted each morning to ensure perfect alignment. The chalkboard was cleaned until it gleamed, my handwriting flowing across its surface in neat, measured lines that students could easily follow. I took pride in this order, in the way my space reflected a mind that could be trusted with young people's education. But I ate lunch alone more often than not, claiming I needed to prepare for afternoon classes or catch up on grading. The faculty lounge felt too exposed, too full of casual conversation that might lead to personal questions I wasn't prepared to answer. My colleagues respected me, included me in necessary meetings and school functions, but I had never cultivated the kind of easy friendships that made work feel like community. It wasn't that they disliked me. I simply remained at arm's length, pleasant but unreachable. At home, Clara maintained the domestic rhythms that kept our household functioning. She worked part-time at the town library, organized neighborhood events, managed our social calendar with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that appearances mattered. Our marriage had settled into a comfortable predictability over the years, passion replaced by partnership, intimacy by routine. We shared meals and responsibilities, attended school functions and community gatherings as a unit, presented the image of a stable family to the world around us. The wedding photograph on our mantel captured us on what should have been the happiest day of our lives. Clara looked radiant in her dress, her smile genuine and full of hope. I stood beside her in my rented tuxedo, my hand on her waist, my expression formal, almost distant. Friends and family had commented on how handsome we looked together, how perfectly matched we seemed. But even then, something in my eyes suggested I was performing rather than experiencing the moment. Clara's affection remained constant but measured. She kissed me goodbye each morning, asked about my day when I returned home, shared the details of her own activities with the thoroughness of someone fulfilling a contract. We went through the motions of intimacy when it seemed expected, but passion had become another item on our list of marital obligations, scheduled rather than spontaneous. Naomi was perhaps the one bright, uncomplicated part of my life. At 16, she had inherited her mother's practical intelligence and my love of literature. Though she expressed it through poetry, she wrote in secret and shared only reluctantly. I watched her growing into herself with a mixture of pride and melancholy, knowing that each passing day carried her further from the child who had once crawled into my lap for bedtime stories. She had begun to develop her own opinions about everything from politics to music, challenging me in ways that reminded me how much of life I had stopped questioning years ago. Her independence frightened me sometimes, not because I wanted to control her, but because her willingness to be authentically herself highlighted my own careful self-censorship. She spoke her mind at dinner-table conversations, defended causes she believed in at school, chose friends based on genuine connection rather than social advantage. Watching her navigate adolescence with such integrity made me acutely aware of how much of my own authenticity I had sacrificed for the sake of fitting in. There were small moments when my carefully constructed composure would slip, usually when I thought no one was paying attention. Sometimes, while typing lesson plans or grading papers, I would absently slide my wedding ring off my finger, rolling it between my thumb and forefinger like a worry stone. The indentation it left behind always looked strange to me, a pale band of skin that seemed to belong to someone else. I kept a drawer in my desk locked, claiming it contained sensitive student information. In reality, it held journals I had written sporadically over the years, pages filled with thoughts I couldn't share with anyone, questions I couldn't ask out loud, observations about myself that felt too dangerous to leave lying around. Sometimes I would unlock the drawer just to run my fingers across the leather covers, reassuring myself that some part of my inner life still existed, even if I never allowed it to see daylight. Late at night, when Clara was asleep and Naomi was lost in teenage dreams, I would sometimes find myself looking through old photograph albums, searching for pictures of myself from college, from graduate school, from the years before I had learned to be so careful about what I let show. In those images, I looked different somehow. Younger, obviously, but also more present, more alive. My eyes held a directness that had been replaced by something more guarded, more diplomatic. The man the world saw was reliable, respected, appropriately ambitious but not threatening, devoted to his family and his profession. Parents trusted me with their children's education. Colleagues valued my dependability. Students saw me as demanding but fair. Clara counted on me to be the steady anchor that kept our household from drifting. These were not small accomplishments, and I didn't take them lightly. But underneath all these carefully maintained surfaces, something restless moved like water finding cracks in stone. An aching sense that I was living someone else's life, playing a role I had auditioned for so long ago that I had forgotten it was temporary. The pressed flower between the pages of Whitman had awakened something I thought I had successfully put to sleep years ago, a hunger for something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore anymore. The disruption came on a Tuesday morning in November, though I wouldn't recognize it as disruption until much later. Principal Matthews knocked on my classroom door during my free period, introducing the young man beside him with the kind of practiced enthusiasm reserved for new faculty orientation. Jonah Mercer had just completed his master's degree in English literature at Columbia, Matthews explained, and would be joining us as an assistant teacher for the remainder of the academic year. He would be working primarily with the junior and senior literature classes, and Matthews thought it would be beneficial if I served as his mentor during the transition period. It was the kind of routine administrative decision that happened every few years, nothing that should have registered as particularly significant. But something about Jonah unsettled me from the moment I shook his hand. He was younger than I had expected, probably mid-20s, with dark hair that looked like he had been running his fingers through it and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened at the collar, and I noticed ink stains on his fingers that suggested he still wrote by hand rather than relying entirely on computers. There was an energy about him that felt uncontained, as if he might say or do something unexpected at any moment. I agreed to mentor him because it was what was expected, what a senior faculty member did when asked. We scheduled our first meeting for later that week, and I spent the intervening days preparing materials I thought might be useful. Syllabi from previous years, teaching guides I had developed, observations about the particular challenges and opportunities that came with working at a place like Millbrook Academy. I approached the task with the same methodical thoroughness I brought to everything else in my professional life. Our initial meetings were procedural enough. I showed him around the building, introduced him to other faculty members, explained the unwritten rules that govern daily life at the academy. Jonah listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and expressed genuine appreciation for the guidance. He seemed eager to succeed, aware that landing a position at Millbrook straight out of graduate school was an opportunity not to be taken lightly. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice the ways his approach differed from mine. Where I favored careful analysis and structured discussion, Jonah encouraged students to embody the literature they were studying. He had them act out scenes from plays, read poetry aloud with attention to rhythm and sound, debate the moral complexities of characters as if they were real people making real choices. His classroom buzzed with the kind of engaged energy that I remembered from my earliest years of teaching, before I had learned to prioritize control over inspiration. During our regular check-ins, he would challenge my methods in ways that were respectful but persistent. Why not let students choose their own essay topics rather than assigning predetermined prompts? Wouldn't they connect more deeply with the material if they felt ownership over their learning? His questions were never critical of what I was doing, but they implied possibilities I had stopped considering years ago. I found myself both irritated and intrigued by his confidence. He quoted lines of poetry as if they lived inside him, referenced authors and texts with the kind of intimate familiarity that comes from genuine passion rather than professional obligation. When he talked about Baldwin or Whitman or Morrison, his voice carried a reverence that made me remember why I had fallen in love with literature in the first place. The moment that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in late November. The Academy offered extended study hours twice a week, and faculty members took turns supervising students who needed quiet space to work on assignments or prepare for exams. It was my turn to oversee the evening session, but a faculty meeting ran late, so I arrived at the study room nearly an hour after the scheduled start time. Through the glass doors, I could see Jonah had taken over in my absence. He sat at the front desk with a small group of students gathered around him, their textbooks open, their faces animated by whatever discussion was taking place. I paused in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt what appeared to be a productive session. He was talking about James Baldwin, I realized as I moved closer. One of the students had apparently struggled with an essay assignment about Go Tell It on the Mountain, and Jonah was helping her understand the complexity of John's relationship with his stepfather Gabriel. His hands moved as he spoke, gesturing to emphasize points, occasionally touching the student's textbook to indicate specific passages. The conversation was the kind I remembered from my own graduate seminars, when literature felt like a living thing that could transform how you understood yourself and the world around you. The students were leaning forward, asking follow-up questions, building on each other's observations in ways that suggested they were genuinely engaged rather than simply completing an assignment. As the evening wore on, other students gradually finished their work and left for their dormitories. Eventually, only Jonah remained, gathering papers and erasing notes from the whiteboard. I watched him through the glass doors, noting the casual grace of his movements, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin. When he finished cleaning up, he moved to the chalkboard at the back of the room and began writing something in flowing script. Poetry, I realized, though I couldn't make out the specific words from my position in the hallway. He stepped back to examine what he had written, and I noticed how his shirt cuff had picked up chalk dust during the process. He laughed quietly at something, perhaps at his own absent-mindedness, and brushed the white residue from his sleeve. The gesture left faint streaks against the dark fabric, marking him with the same chalk dust that had become such a familiar part of my own daily routine, but where I always felt slightly soiled by it, something to be cleaned away and forgotten. On him, it looked natural, even attractive, like a badge of engagement with the physical act of teaching. Something shifted inside me as I watched him. It wasn't attraction in any sense I was prepared to acknowledge, not then, but it was recognition of something I had once possessed and somehow lost. The fearlessness to be fully present in a moment, to let passion for ideas spill over into physical space, to laugh at your own imperfections rather than trying to hide them. I thought of my own teaching, how carefully controlled everything had become over the years. My handwriting was precise, my chalk use minimal and efficient, my appearance always immaculate by the end of each day. I had learned to contain myself so thoroughly that even my enthusiasms felt calculated, measured out in appropriate doses. Finally, I knocked on the door and entered the study room. Jonah turned toward me with that easy smile I was beginning to associate with him, apologizing for running over the scheduled time. He explained about the student who had needed extra help with Baldwin, how the conversation had evolved into a broader discussion about literature and identity, how time had gotten away from him. I thanked him for covering my absence, complimented him on the engaged discussion I had witnessed. He began gathering his things, and I found myself reluctant to let the evening end, though I couldn't have explained why. We talked briefly about the upcoming semester, about lesson plans and student assessments, the kind of professional conversation that should have felt routine. When we finally left the study room together, Jonah paused to lock the door behind us. The click of the lock seemed unnaturally loud in the empty hallway, echoing off the walls in a way that made me hyper-aware of our solitude. For a moment, we stood in the dim corridor lighting, two men at the end of a workday, and I felt something pass between us that I couldn't name. He said goodnight and headed toward his car, leaving me alone in the hallway with the lingering scent of chalk dust and the uncomfortable awareness that something in my carefully ordered world had been disturbed in ways I wasn't ready to examine. In the weeks that followed, Jonah began seeking my guidance with increasing frequency. What had started as formal mentoring sessions evolved into something more fluid, more personal. He would appear in my classroom doorway during free periods, asking questions that went beyond curriculum and classroom management into the deeper territories of teaching as a calling rather than simply a profession. He wanted to understand how to reach students who seemed disengaged, how to make literature feel relevant to teenagers who lived in a world of social media and instant gratification. But his questions often drifted into more philosophical territory. How do you balance staying true to the material with making it accessible? How do you maintain passion for books you've taught dozens of times? How do you know when you're making a real difference in someone's life? These were questions I had stopped asking myself years ago, and hearing them from him stirred something I thought I had outgrown. I found myself staying after school more often, ostensibly to help him prepare lesson plans or review student assessments, but really because our conversations had become the most intellectually stimulating part of my week. The study room became our informal office during these extended sessions. We would spread papers across the long table, annotated texts, and grading rubrics mixing together as we worked through the practical challenges of teaching literature to privileged teenagers. The late autumn sun would fade through the tall windows, and eventually we would need to turn on the overhead lights, creating a warm bubble of productivity in the otherwise empty building. Chalk dust seemed to follow us everywhere during these sessions. It settled on our sleeves as we wrote notes on the blackboard, accumulated under our fingernails as we gestured toward passages we wanted to emphasize, dusted our shirts when we leaned against the board while thinking through particularly complex ideas. Where I had always been careful to clean myself off at the end of each day, I began to notice that I carried traces of it home with me, small reminders of the hours we had spent together. As December approached and our conversations deepened, Jonah began sharing stories from his own experience that went beyond professional development. He talked about graduate school at Columbia, about the loneliness of being surrounded by brilliant minds while feeling fundamentally different from most of his peers. He described growing up in a small town in Ohio where being intellectual was already suspect, where questioning things too deeply marked you as someone who didn't quite belong. He spoke about books that had saved him during adolescence, authors who had made him feel less alone in the world. Baldwin and Morrison, yes, but also poets like Frank O'Hara and Richard Wilbur, writers who had shown him that language could be a refuge for people who felt displaced by the expectations of others. His voice would change when he talked about literature this way, becoming softer, more vulnerable, as if he were sharing secrets. I found myself listening with an intensity that surprised me. Part of it was professional interest in understanding how a younger colleague had developed such a sophisticated relationship with texts I had been teaching for years. But there was something else, something that made my chest tighten with a mixture of envy and admiration I couldn't quite name. He inhabited himself without apology in ways I had forgotten were possible. One evening in mid-December, as we worked late reviewing final exam materials, Jonah began talking about the unspoken loves that had shaped his understanding of literature. He described crushes on classmates who never knew he existed, professors whose approval he sought with an intensity that went beyond academic achievement, friends whose casual affection left him aching for something more substantial. He talked about learning to read between the lines of poems and novels, finding hints of experiences that mainstream culture didn't acknowledge, but that felt familiar to him in ways he couldn't articulate at the time. How discovering writers who shared his sense of being fundamentally different had been like finding a secret language that finally made sense of his interior life. As he spoke, I felt something cracking open inside me, some carefully maintained barrier between past and present. I remembered my own college years, the intensity of friendships that felt like more than friendship, the way certain poems could make my heart race in ways I told myself were purely aesthetic. I had learned to bury those responses so deeply that I had almost convinced myself they had never existed. The moment that changed everything happened on a Thursday night, when most of the building was empty except for us. We had been working on comparative essay assignments, trying to develop prompts that would challenge students to think critically about the connections between different texts. Jonah had suggested pairing Baldwin's Giovanni's Room with something more contemporary, and he had pulled out a collection of poetry to show me specific passages that might work. He leaned across the table to point to a particular poem, his shoulder brushing against mine as he traced the lines with his finger. The proximity was casual, the kind of accidental contact that happens when two people are working closely together. But I found myself acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of his body, the faint scent of coffee and chalk dust that seemed to cling to his clothes. As he read the poem aloud, his voice taking on the rhythm and cadence of the verses, I noticed a smudge of chalk on his wrist where his shirt cuff had pulled back. It was such a small thing, barely visible in the fluorescent lighting, but I couldn't stop staring at it. The white powder against his skin looked almost deliberate, like a mark of authenticity that proved he belonged in this world of ideas and words. Without thinking, without any conscious decision, I reached out and brushed the chalk away with my thumb. The contact lasted only a second, skin against skin, but it sent an electric shock through my entire body. Jonah froze, his reading trailing off mid-sentence, his eyes meeting mine with an expression I couldn't decipher. For a moment that seemed to stretch impossibly long, we sat motionless, the weight of what had just happened settling between us. Then Jonah smiled, not the easy, professional smile I had become accustomed to, but something quieter, more knowing. It wasn't mockery or embarrassment, but recognition, as if he had been waiting for me to acknowledge something that had been building for weeks. Neither of us said anything about it. He finished reading the poem, we completed our work for the evening, and we packed up our materials with the same careful efficiency that had become routine. But everything felt different, charged with possibilities I wasn't ready to examine too closely. That night, I drove home through the familiar landscape with my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The brief touch of Jonah's skin seemed to burn on my thumb, a sensation that followed me as I went through the motions of domestic life. Clara commented on how quiet I seemed during dinner, and Naomi asked if I was feeling all right, but I managed to deflect their concerns with explanations about end-of-semester stress. Later, lying in bed beside Clara while she slept peacefully, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment over and over. The way Jonah's wrist had felt warm under my touch, the way he had looked at me afterward with those dark eyes, the way something fundamental had shifted in the space between us. For the first time in years, I felt completely awake, every nerve ending alert to possibilities I had spent decades learning to ignore. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you wanted to jump. The breaking point arrived with the first major snowstorm of winter. By mid-morning, the administration had made the decision to cancel afternoon classes and send day students home early. The boarding students retreated to their dormitories, and most of the faculty packed up their materials and headed out before the roads became impassable. I should have left too. Clara had called during lunch to say she was leaving the library early, that Naomi was already home from school, that they would have dinner waiting whenever I could make it through the weather. But when Jonah stopped by my classroom to ask if I wanted to stay and catch up on grading, I found myself agreeing without really thinking about the implications. The building felt different with so few people in it. Our footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as we made our way to the study room, arms full of papers that had been accumulating for weeks. Outside, the snow fell steadily, transforming the familiar campus into something hushed and otherworldly. The windows of the study room looked out onto a landscape that seemed suspended in time, everything soft and white and silent. We worked steadily for the first few hours, the familiar rhythm of reading and commenting and sorting papers into stacks. The overhead lights cast a warm glow that made the room feel separate from the storm outside, a pocket of productivity in the midst of winter's chaos. Our conversation was easy, professional, focused on student work and semester wrap-up, nothing that should have felt particularly significant. But as the afternoon faded into early evening, something shifted between us. Maybe it was the isolation, the sense that the rest of the world had retreated and left us alone together. Maybe it was the whiskey Jonah produced from his bag around 5 o'clock, a small flask he had apparently been saving for exactly this kind of situation. He poured modest amounts into 2 coffee mugs, explaining that his graduate school friends had taught him that grading always went better with a little liquid encouragement. The whiskey warmed me in ways that went beyond the alcohol, loosening something in my chest that had been held tightly for weeks. We talked more freely than we ever had before, our conversation drifting from professional topics to more personal territory. Jonah shared stories about his childhood, about feeling fundamentally different from everyone around him, about learning to find community in books when the real world felt unwelcoming. As the snow continued to fall outside and the whiskey worked its subtle magic, the distance between us seemed to shrink. We had moved from sitting across the table to sitting beside each other, papers spread between us, shoulders occasionally brushing as we reached for different stacks of essays. The chalk dust that had accumulated on our sleeves during the day now seemed like a mark of collaboration, evidence of work shared rather than individual effort. Around 7 o'clock, when we had finally made significant progress through the grading, Jonah pulled out a slim volume of poetry I didn't recognize. He said he wanted to show me something that might work for next semester's curriculum, a contemporary poet who wrote about identity and belonging in ways that felt both timeless and urgent. He found the poem he was looking for, and began reading aloud, his voice taking on that particular quality it always had when he encountered language that moved him. The words were about hidden love, about devotion that couldn't be spoken aloud, about the weight of carrying feelings that had no acceptable place in the world. His voice caught slightly on certain lines, as if the words meant something specific to him, as if he were sharing more than just literary appreciation. The poem talked about loving someone in silence, about the particular ache of wanting what couldn't be acknowledged, about finding beauty in stolen glances and accidental touches. As he read, I felt something inside me breaking open, all the careful barriers I had constructed over the years crumbling under the weight of recognition. When he finished reading, the silence that followed felt different from any quiet we had shared before. It was charged, expectant, full of things that couldn't be unsaid once they were spoken aloud. Outside, the storm continued to muffle the world in white, but inside our small circle of lamplight, everything felt exposed, vulnerable, impossibly present. I don't remember making a conscious decision to move closer to him. It felt more like gravity, like something inevitable that had been building for weeks without my full awareness. My hand found his on the table between us, fingers covering fingers, skin touching skin in a way that couldn't be dismissed as accidental. The contact sent electricity through my entire body, the same shock I had felt when I brushed the chalk from his wrist weeks earlier, but amplified beyond anything I was prepared to handle. His skin was warm, slightly rough from chalk and cold weather, completely real in a way that made everything else in the room fade into background. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand palm up beneath mine, allowing our fingers to interlock in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. The simple touch contained everything I had been refusing to acknowledge about myself, about what I wanted, about what had been missing from my carefully constructed life. Looking at our joined hands, I felt the full weight of the truth I had been carrying in silence for so long. Not just attraction to this particular man, though that was part of it, but recognition of something fundamental about myself that I had spent decades trying to bury. The part of me that had pressed flowers between pages of poetry, that had loved too intensely and too quietly, that had built a life around what was acceptable rather than what was true. When I finally looked up and met his eyes, I saw something that took my breath away. Not surprise, not confusion, but understanding. As if he had been waiting for me to catch up to what he had already seen, already known. His expression was gentle, patient, but also unmistakably certain about what was happening between us. I whispered something then, though I'm not sure if it was his name or an apology or simply an acknowledgement of what we both knew had changed irrevocably. He squeezed my hand in response, a gesture that felt like forgiveness and invitation simultaneously. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that warm room, surrounded by the detritus of our shared work and the lingering scent of chalk dust and whiskey, I felt the last of my resistance dissolve. For the first time in decades, I was completely present in my own life, awake to possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine. In the days that followed the storm, I moved through my life like a man walking through water. Everything felt different, slower, more deliberate, as if the simple act of existing required conscious effort. The revelation of that evening in the study room had cracked something fundamental inside me, and I could feel the fractures spreading through every aspect of my carefully constructed world. Clara noticed immediately, though she said nothing at first. Her eyes would follow me as I went through the motions of domestic routine, drinking coffee that tasted like ash, responding to her questions about my day with answers that felt scripted. At dinner, I would catch her studying my face with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for books that weren't quite making sense. The ordinary intimacies of marriage became impossible to navigate. When she reached for my hand while we watched television, I would find excuses to pull away, claiming I needed to grade papers or prepare lessons. When she kissed me goodnight, I felt like I was betraying everyone involved, including myself. The wedding ring on my finger began to feel like a weight I couldn't bear, a symbol of promises I had made in good faith, but could no longer honor. Naomi, with the particular sensitivity that teenagers develop for adult emotional undercurrents, began asking if I was feeling all right. Her questions were casual but persistent, the way she might probe about whether I was getting sick or worried about work. I deflected as best I could, but she had inherited my tendency to notice what others tried to hide, and I could see her growing concern in the way she watched me during our increasingly rare family meals. At school, I threw myself into end-of-semester responsibilities with the desperation of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. I graded papers with obsessive thoroughness, prepared lesson plans weeks in advance, organized my classroom with military precision. But underneath all this frantic productivity, I was acutely aware of Jonah's presence in the building, of the conversations we weren't having, of the weight of what had passed between us. We maintained professional distance during those first few days, exchanging polite greetings in the hallways, sticking to safe topics during faculty meetings. But I could feel his eyes on me sometimes, could sense his questions even when he didn't voice them. The careful space we were maintaining felt artificial, unsustainable, like holding our breath underwater. The confrontation with Clara came on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after the storm. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the same page of essays for 20 minutes without reading a single word, when she finally sat down across from me and folded her hands in the way that meant she had reached the limit of her patience. She said my name quietly, the way she might address a child who had been caught in a lie. When I looked up, her expression wasn't angry or accusatory, but tired, resigned, as if she had been carrying a burden for longer than I realized. She told me she had been watching me pull away for years, not just days or weeks, but gradually, incrementally, like someone slowly turning down the volume on a radio until it was barely audible. She said she had tried to convince herself it was work stress, or middle age, or the natural evolution of long marriage, but she could no longer pretend that what was happening between us was normal or sustainable. Her voice trembled when she said she felt like she had been living with a ghost, someone who went through all the motions of being a husband and father but was never fully present, never completely engaged. She said she loved me, had always loved me, but she couldn't continue being the stand-in for a life I had never really chosen. The honesty of it cut through me like a blade. I wanted to reassure her, to find words that would repair what was breaking between us, but I discovered I had no defense against the truth she was speaking. Everything she said was accurate, fair, and devastating in its clarity. I tried to explain myself, to find language for what was happening inside me, but the words felt inadequate, dangerous. How could I tell her about Jonah, about the pressed flower between pages of Whitman, about the decades of careful self-denial that were finally demanding their due? How could I explain that the problem wasn't her, wasn't our marriage exactly, but something fundamental about who I was and what I had been hiding from myself? In the end, all I could do was apologize, though we both knew that wasn't enough. She cried quietly, not with surprise, but with the particular grief that comes from having your worst fears confirmed. We sat in the kitchen we had shared for years, surrounded by the accumulated debris of family life, and acknowledged that something essential had died between us, probably long before I was ready to admit it. The next evening, I found myself returning to the study room where everything had changed. The building was mostly empty, as it often was on Friday nights, and I wasn't even sure why I had come. Perhaps I needed to be in the space where I had finally stopped lying to myself, or perhaps I was hoping to find some clarity in the place where my old life had begun its collapse. Jonah was there when I arrived, sitting at the same table where we had shared whiskey and poetry a week earlier. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something in his expression that might have been relief, as if he had been waiting for me to appear. We talked quietly about nothing important at first, the way people do when they're afraid of the conversation they really need to have. But eventually, the weight of unspoken things became too much, and I found myself trying to explain the impossible position I was in, the choice that felt like no choice at all. He listened without judgment as I described the confrontation with Clara, the growing awareness that continuing as before would be cruel to everyone involved. I told him about the years of careful construction that had brought me to this point, about the life I had built on the foundation of what seemed safe rather than what was true. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing patterns on the table surface between us. Finally, he looked up and said gently that he couldn't make this decision for me, that what was happening between us was real but couldn't exist in the half measures that had defined most of my adult life. He said that living halfway would be unfair to Clara, to Naomi, to me, and ultimately to him as well. That whatever we were discovering about ourselves and each other deserved more than stolen moments and careful silence. That the choice I was facing wasn't really between him and my family, but between continuing to hide from myself and finally having the courage to live authentically. His words carried the weight of someone who had already made his own difficult choices, who understood the cost of both honesty and deception. As he spoke, I felt the last of my resistance crumble, replaced by a terrible clarity about what I needed to do. The choice crystallized in that moment, sharp and unavoidable. I could continue the elaborate performance that had sustained me for decades, maintaining the careful distance that kept everyone safe but no one truly happy. Or I could finally stop running from the truth about who I was and what I wanted, even if it meant shattering everything I had built. Sitting in that room where chalk dust still lingered in the air, where poetry had awakened something I thought was safely buried, I finally understood that there was no middle ground. The life I had constructed was ending whether I chose it or not. The only question was whether I would have the courage to be honest about why. I woke before dawn on the morning I finally chose truth over safety. The house held that particular stillness that comes in the hour before the world begins to stir, when even the familiar sounds of settling wood and ticking clocks seem muffled by the weight of sleep. Clara breathed quietly beside me, her face peaceful in the dim light filtering through our bedroom curtains. Naomi's room remained sealed behind her closed door, teenage dreams protecting her from the adult complications that waited just beyond graduation. I moved through the house like a ghost, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors I had walked for 8 years. Everything looked the same in the pre-dawn darkness, but I found myself seeing it all as if for the first time, or perhaps for the last time. The family photographs arranged on the mantel, the books Clara had organized by author on our living room shelves, the coffee maker that would soon gurgle to life for a morning routine I would not be part of. In the kitchen, I sat at the table where we had shared thousands of meals, where homework had been completed and vacation plans discussed, where Clara had confronted me with the truth about our half-lived marriage just days earlier. The surface was clear except for a salt and pepper set Naomi had made in middle school pottery class, slightly lopsided but cherished for the hands that had shaped it. My wedding ring felt impossibly heavy on my finger, a weight I had carried for so long that I had forgotten what my hand felt like without it. I slipped it off slowly, rolling the gold band between my fingers one last time before placing it on the counter beside the folded note I had written to Clara. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind we used for formal correspondence, though no stationery seemed adequate for what I needed to say. The letter had taken me hours to write, draft after draft, until I found words that felt both honest and kind. I had tried to explain what couldn't really be explained, to apologize for what couldn't be undone, to express love and regret in equal measure. I told her she deserved someone who could love her completely, without reservation, without the careful distance that had defined our relationship from the beginning. I told her this wasn't her fault, wasn't a failure on her part, but something fundamental about who I was that I had been too afraid to acknowledge. In the distance, I could hear the faint echo of memory. Naomi's laughter from some long ago Saturday morning when she was still young enough to find everything delightful, when the future seemed like an adventure rather than a series of difficult choices. The sound felt both precious and painful, a reminder of what I was leaving behind and what I had failed to give her during the years when she needed it most. On the table before me lay the worn copy of Whitman that had started this entire reckoning. The pressed flower was still there between its pages, as fragile as paper, but somehow still intact after all these years. I closed the book carefully, feeling the weight of everything it represented. The young man I had been when I first read these poems, the dreams I had buried, the authentic self I had spent decades learning to hide. I slipped the book into the bag I had packed the night before, along with a few other essentials that felt important enough to carry into whatever came next. Not many possessions, in the end. Most of what I was leaving behind was more valuable than what I could take with me, but also more complicated, bound up in obligations and expectations that had shaped me for so long I wasn't sure who I would be without them. The house began to show signs of waking as I prepared to leave. The automatic coffee maker clicked on with its familiar gurgle. Somewhere upstairs, Clara stirred, probably beginning the slow process of consciousness that would lead to her discovering my absence. The ring on the counter, the letter that would change everything for her as well. I thought about Naomi, about how she would process this disruption to the only family structure she had ever known. She was strong, independent, more resilient than I gave her credit for, but that didn't make abandoning her any easier to justify. I hoped someday she would understand that staying would have meant continuing to model a kind of half-hearted existence that would have taught her all the wrong lessons about love and authenticity. Standing at the back door, I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar texture of chalk dust clinging to the fabric. It had become such a constant presence that I barely noticed it anymore. But now it felt significant, like a talisman connecting me to the work that had meaning and the person who had helped me remember who I really was. The white powder was invisible in the early morning darkness, but I could feel it against my fingertips, proof of engagement, of genuine connection, of the messy reality of lives fully lived. I stepped outside into the sharp clarity of December dawn. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible, and the world was painted in the gray tones that come just before sunrise. Everything felt suspended, poised between what had been and what might come next. The familiar neighborhood stretched out before me, houses full of people living lives that suddenly seemed both enviable and impossible. Behind me, the door closed with a quiet click that seemed to echo in the still air. I didn't look back at the house where I had tried so hard to become the man everyone expected me to be. Instead, I faced the horizon where the first hints of light were beginning to show, where the day waited with all its uncertainties and possibilities. I had no clear plan beyond honesty, no destination except away from the elaborate performance that had sustained me for so long. But for the first time in decades, I felt completely awake, present in my own life rather than observing it from a careful distance. The fear was enormous, overwhelming, but underneath it was something I had almost forgotten existed. Not happiness, exactly, but the potential for it. Not certainty, but the courage to live without it. The silence around me was final and heavy, weighted with loss and regret, and the particular sadness that comes with necessary endings. But it was also alive with possibility, electric with the sense that anything might happen next. I had finally stopped running from the truth about who I was, and whatever came after would be built on that foundation, messy and painful and real. I walked toward my car, toward the uncertain future I had finally chosen over the safe past I was leaving behind. The chalk dust in my pocket was the only thing I carried from my old life that I wanted to keep.